Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Vijay Raghavan, Professor in the Center for Criminology and Justice, School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. We're doing a module today called Social Work Interventions in the Criminal Justice System, which is part of the course Fields of Practice within the discipline of social work. Basically, we will be trying to cover in this module involuntary clients, what is meant by involuntary clients, the different approaches to social work within the criminal justice system, the skills and strategies in criminal justice social work, and field action projects at TISS, which have played a role in highlighting this area of criminal justice social work. One of the approaches which is very relevant to social work within the field of criminal justice is known as the social conflict approach. Now, what is the social conflict approach? Basically, the social conflict approach believes that as opposed to traditional social work practice, which is dependent on the good relationship model, when you are dealing with so-called involuntary clients, who are involuntary clients? They are not people who have come there of their own free volition, but have been forced to come there either by the law or by their family and the community. For example, prisoners, people who are in substance abuse, or other categories of offenders with whom social work has to be carried out. These are not people who have voluntarily come into that system, but they have been brought there. Because of that, there is a lack of matching in terms of the objectives of what that person wants and what the social worker is planning to achieve. The social worker may be actually trying to work towards the reformation and rehabilitation of the person, but this person may actually only be interested in getting out of the institution. So the objectives don't match. When the objectives don't match, it is very difficult to establish a good relationship model, which is traditionally the model in therapeutic approach in social work. So what the social conflict approach is, it says that we must accept the fact that there is a disagreement in objectives as well as the disagreement in the methods between the social worker and his or her client. And the moment you accept this disagreement, then you have to believe that the good relationship model cannot work. Your objective is not to establish rapport with the client, but your objective is to see how you can transact a negotiated process whereby it's going to involve the social worker playing multiple roles. One could be the role of the enforcer, the negotiator, the mediator, the advocate, and the coach. Now, it also would involve positive use of authority as against the negative use of authority. And there is a lot of scope of bargaining and persuasion in trying to negotiate, which means that there are some things that the person may agree to and there are some things that the person may not agree to. For example, in a prison situation, one of the things on which both can agree, both the social worker and the client can agree, is that access to legal aid. That is something that the client will also agree, and that is something that the social worker may agree. But if the client actually wants your help in transporting some goods out of the prison system or smuggling some letter out because he or she wants help from somebody who may not be a pro-social element, then there cannot be an agreement between the social worker and the client. So this approach is known as the social conflict approach, which views therapy as a political process, one that involves the socially sanctioned use of power or influence in a context of conflicting interests between the client and some part of his or her social environment. As opposed to this, you also have the human rights approach, which is basically an approach which puts clients right at the center of the interest to help address issues of social inequality, discrimination, oppression, and social injustice. It follows the 6S framework. One is the social concern and consciousness. That means any social work should be born out of social concern and consciousness. It should work with socially disadvantaged groups as the priority. It should assume that for every individual action there is a social context. It should believe that all human behavior is a result of social construction. That means we are not born with certain kinds of behaviors, but we are molded into it through a process of social construction. that the ultimate goal of social work is social change, and that the objective is to bring about social equality. Sam Lewis, 2005, talks about rehabilitation as something that involves providing the minimum services necessary for an offender to reintegrate into society, whereby the state should provide opportunities to overcome disadvantages that limit their ability to cope without committing crime. Rehabilitation goals and sentences are separate, and the latter are based on the culpability of the offender. Voluntary rehabilitation is what one should talk about as opposed to coerced rehabilitation. When we talk about skills and strategies in criminal justice social work, it is very important, first of all, to clarify what is the role of the social worker to the client. Because very often the client may have a different view of what the social worker is here for, and the social worker may not necessarily have the same view. So there has to be an initial process of role clarification and understanding and coming to some kind of a mutual agreement of what both the social worker and the client are willing to engage in, and which means that first you need to find out what is negotiable and what is non-negotiable between the client and the social worker, as well as the community and the society. Once you have identified the negotiables and the non-negotiables, then it is easier to move forward in the relationship. In the worker-client relationship, as I've already said, there are various roles that the social worker has to play. That of being a negotiator, an enforcer, sometimes a mediator between two parties, like for example between the police and the offender, sometimes an advocate talking on behalf of the client to the prison administration or to the family, and sometimes also coaching the person in terms of how he or she has to deal with his or her life. It also involves a very advanced skills of bargaining and persuasion, because you are dealing with a person who is actually, his life and liberty is at stake, and therefore he or she is able to bring much more into the relationship than you can. If you lose in this battle, at the most you will lose your self-respect or your professional pride. But if the client loses the battle, then he might actually lose his freedom. So from that point of view, this is really a relationship where you have to invest a lot, and there is also a need to use positive use of authority rather than negative use. You need to reinforce pro-social behavior, and in this, what is pro-social behavior? Actions and values which support and care for others. And also the social worker himself or herself acting as an instrument of social change, which means that the person himself or herself should first be aware of his strengths and weaknesses and should be willing to admit what he is capable of and what he is not, and therefore to what extent he can move forward in the relationship. It also believes in the principle of collaborative problem solving, which means that the client has an equal stake in the entire process and therefore is an equal partner or is a substantive partner in the problem solving process. Identifying strategies with the client to achieve the goals that both have together agreed to. In terms of the training that social workers have received within the criminal justice system, historically speaking, the first formal training of correctional officers began here at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, through the department of, then known as the Department of Criminology and Correctional Administration, now known as the Center for Criminology and Justice. The history of correctional social work in India is intertwined with the history of the Department of Criminology and Correctional Administration at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. The Department of Criminology was the first criminology department set up in India somewhere in the 1953 or 1954. What happened was that prior to independence, most of our freedom fighters had been to prisons. They were prison inmates themselves. And I think that really sensitized them to the issue of people in custody. So when in modern independent India, when the government took over, one of the things that the then Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru did was to understand the importance of prison reforms, and for that process he invited a renowned UN correctional expert and a very famous criminologist by the name of Dr. Walter C. Reckless, and along with him another UN expert called Edward Galloway, to come to India and to be here for some months and help lay down the correctional policy for a modern India. Dr. Reckless and Dr. Galloway did come to India, and they spent almost a year here. And interestingly, they spent a good few months here at Tata Institute. And then along with the then director of TIS, Dr. Kumarappa, J. Kumarappa, the two of them worked tirelessly to really help lay down what would then become the basic infrastructure for criminal justice social work or correctional social work. First of all, Dr. Reckless, based on his work, recommended that there is a need to set up a new jail manual committee which will identify what should be a model prison manual which all states can adopt. So in 1957, a jail manual committee was set up, and it gave its report in 1960. The first training program for prison officers took place here in Tata Institute, which was a 6 months training. The first training program for probation officers took place here in Tata Institute. The first conference of Inspectors General of Prison was held here in Tata Institute, and a lot of these efforts were made, thanks to the involvement of Dr. Walter C. Reckless. Following the setting up of the Department of Criminology, initially for the good next 30 years, most of the graduates who came out from this institute with a specialization in criminology and correctional administration were actually government nominated officers who were selected by the government as jailers, welfare officers, prison officers, probation officers, but then were subsequently sent to TIS to do the 2-year master's program in social work with specialization in criminology and correctional administration. And today, if you find, you'll find a lot of senior officers in various departments in the country, in prisons and welfare departments, who are actually graduates and alumni of TIS. However, over a period of time, the government started opening its own training academies. The first such prison training academy was started in Lucknow, called the Jail Officers Training School. Subsequently, there were 2 other training academies opened, one in Vellore and one in Chandigarh, which were known as the Regional Institutes of Correctional Administration. The Chandigarh RICA was meant for the northern states, the RICA Vellore was meant for the southern states. Today, these two have been renamed. The Vellore one is now called Academy of Prisons and Correctional Administration. The Chandigarh one is known as the Institute of Correctional Administration. Then the Jail Officers Training School was started in Pune. So what began to happen is, when the government started its own training academies, they stopped deputing candidates to TISS. And since then, we started having new initiatives whereby our own students, after graduating from TIS, were interested in starting various kinds of field action projects. Way back in the 1950s, when government officers, jailers, welfare officers, probation officers came here for doing the 2-year training process, and after gaining the training, they went back into the department and started their work as correctional officers. But over a period of time, this deputation system stopped, and since then, since the 1970s and 80s, at TIS, we have mostly fresh graduates of BCom, BSc, engineering, social sciences coming to do this course. And after graduating and after doing their degree in social work with specialization in criminology and justice now, then they go and work in different NGOs which are working in the field of human rights, which are working in the area of aftercare and rehabilitation, which are working on access to justice, etc., etc. One of the very special features of the Center for Criminology and Justice has been the efforts to initiate field action projects in the field of criminal justice, which has been going on since the last 3 decades. There are other departments within the School of Social Work which have also been doing similar work in the criminal justice system. Some of the pioneering field action projects include Prayas, which has been working for the last 27 years in prisons and custodial institutions, working with offender populations, working with victims of crimes, with families, with children of prisoners, with women rescued from commercial sexual exploitation, towards their legal rights and rehabilitation. The Resource Cell on Juvenile Justice, which is almost a decade old now, working to improve the juvenile justice system with a special focus on children in conflict with law. There is the special cell for women and children, which has been working with the police system to help women victims of domestic violence and other cases of sexual and other forms of violence, which is a field action project of the Center for Women-Centered Practice within the School of Social Work. There is Koshish, which works with homeless people and people who are arrested under beggary. This is a field action project which is attached to the director's office at TISS. And then there is Tanda, which works with for the rights and entitlements of the denotified and nomadic tribes who have been criminalized earlier by a law called the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. I've already mentioned about some of these field action projects, but I would like to open up a little more about what these projects are doing. Prayas, for example, started as a small initiative in 1990 with just one social worker being appointed to work in Arthur Road Prison in Mumbai, which is otherwise known as the Mumbai Central Prison. But gradually over a period of time, it has expanded its scope of work now to 5 prisons, 4 in Mumbai and Thane region, 1 in Bharuch in Gujarat. It is working in 2 shelter homes for women. It is working in 1 police station in Gujarat, and it is also working in observation home with children in conflict with law in Mumbai and in Thane district as well as in Bharuch district in Gujarat. So what is happening is, apart from the groundwork that this project is doing, it has also been involved in a number of policy advocacy initiatives. It has been engaged in doing research, doing field action work, whereby organizing training programs for criminal justice functionaries on various correctional laws like the Probation of Offenders Act, on sensitizing the police and the judiciary on various issues relating to the rehabilitation and legal rights of persons in custody. It has also engaged in judicial interventions. For example, it first engaged with the Supreme Court in 2006 when a PIL was going on called the R.D. Upadhyay versus State of Andhra Pradesh and others about the situation of children of women prisoners, and Prayas had done a study on the situation. It submitted its report to the court, and based on that the court was able to give detailed directions about what should be the minimum conditions in which children living in prisons with their mothers should be kept in. It has also engaged in other PILs in the Bombay High Court from time to time on various issues related to legal aid, relating to the situation of under trial prisoners, etc. Similarly, Koshish, which was started way back in 2006 as a field action project working with homeless people and people arrested under the beggary law, which is a highly draconian law which criminalizes poverty. That means anybody who does not have any ostensible source of earning can also be arrested under this act simply because he may be a poor person. Now it is working in 4 to 5 states. It has been successful in bringing about a draft law which is now on the website of the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, which will replace these Beggars Act and reduce the powers of the police in terms of the arrest powers that they have. And will also, the draft law also talks about rehabilitation of persons who are homeless and are people living on the streets. Tanda, for example, which works with the rights and entitlement of denotified and nomadic tribes, has now started initially as a small project in 1 location in Mumbai, is now working in 3 to 4 locations in Mumbai and Navi Mumbai. And it has also been instrumental in now forming a national action group on NTDNTs, whereby small civil society organizations working with different nomadic tribes and different nomadic communities have all come together, and they have been able to form an alliance which is now working towards creating a lobby which can fight for the rights of nomadic and denotified tribes. What do social workers do in the police system? Why do we need social workers in the police system? Is that by virtue of being available through the day, they end up being the first point of contact for numerous issues that citizens need to deal with. Between 45 to 50% of police work in urban areas and a greater portion in rural areas is unrelated to crime, what are known as non-cognizable offenses. And this is where social workers can play a great role in trying to mitigate the disputes that are taking place between different sections of society. There is a distinction between police social work and social work with police, because police social work is essentially talking about social work intervention in police settings, whereas social work with police talks about what kind of interventions can be done with police personnel. The Special Cell for Women and Children, which works with the police system to provide relief and justice to violated women, is one example of the presence of social workers in the police system. The Special Cell works with a supportive role to the police, understanding the boundaries between the social workers and the police. They believe in the self-determination principle of the woman. What does she want, and accordingly work, and have a non-judgmental attitude towards what the woman wants. In terms of Prayas's attempts towards working with the police system, Prayas, when it was placing social workers in the police system, worked with cases of family conflicts, neighborhood disputes, harassment of senior citizens, persons with emotional or psychological disturbance, runaways and elopement cases, missing persons, mentally disturbed persons. All these categories of people land up in the police station for some reason or the other, and they do not get the necessary help because they don't fall in the category of hardcore crime. The services offered include home visits, providing emotional support, providing legal aid and assistance, and referrals to appropriate welfare agencies. When we talk about the role of social workers in the juvenile justice system, firstly we need to recognize that the JJ Act was first enacted as a national law in 1986 and then has gone through a series of amendments. Presently, the Juvenile Justice Care and Protection Act 2015. Social workers have always been part of the juvenile justice system since the enactment of the Children's Acts in the pre-British times. And this divides children into two categories: children in need of care and protection and children in conflict with law. Social workers are also appointed as part of the Juvenile Justice Board, which deals with children in conflict with law. Social workers have a role to play in shelter homes for children, as probation officers and as counselors. When you look at one of the field action projects of TIS, the Resource Cell on Juvenile Justice, it was conceptualized in 2005 with the objective of working on issues relating to children with a special focus on children in conflict with law. It does direct work with children in terms of casework, counseling, and helping them rehabilitate. It also does a lot of group activities with these children, starting open forum discussions, art therapy, de-addiction centers, and it is also engaged in policy advocacy to create a more child-friendly environment. Coming to the role of social workers in correctional settings and aftercare, the UN Standard Minimum Rules for Treatment of Prisoners 1955 lays down that aftercare services should be provided by member states, and India as a signatory to the UN Standard Minimum Rules. The Prisons Act of 1894 talks about what prisons are meant for, and one of the objectives is rehabilitation. In terms of reform committees, all these reform committees, not the first one, which was the Indian Jails Committee in 1919, 1920, but then since then the Model Prison Manual of 1960, 2003 and now 2016, the Justice A.N. Mullah Committee report, which is known as the All India Committee on Jail Reforms in 1983, the Krishna Iyer Committee, which is also known as the National Expert Committee on Women Prisoners in 1987. All these committee reports have recommended that social workers have a very important role to play in the rehabilitation process of people who need correctional services. So, summing up this discussion, what is the role that social workers can play in correctional settings and aftercare? The emphasis is on involvement of community participation and the role of NGOs in corrections. When you're talking of rehabilitation, it is simplistic to think that rehabilitation will take place without the involvement of the community. And there has to be a two-pronged approach to tackle the problem of crime and rehabilitation of offenders. One is to counter socio-economic conditions that contributed to the crime, and two is to extend all possible help to those who are already in the situation, which is release prisoners, to resettle them back in society. So you have to strike at the root cause and try to look at what is leading to increasing crime in society and address those issues. You also need to continuously work with that population which is in the meanwhile getting processed through the system. Involvement, you also need to involve experts from the field of education, medicine, psychiatry, law, social work and journalism in framing and running the correctional policy and at functional and advisory levels. And this has come out from the recommendation of the Mullah Committee report. The role of social workers is to effectively deal with the anxieties of inmates, particularly under trials, with respect to their families and children, to assist prisoners more usefully, especially to serve as a liaison between the prisoner and his or her family, to arrange activities, both recreational, educational, vocational, as well as awareness for under trial as well as convicted prisoners, to be useful to the prison management, to understand social and group dynamics and to use it to the advantage of the prisoner as well as the custodial staff. The social workers' counseling inputs should encompass the custodial staff as well as the inmates. So with this, we kind of trying to wrap up some of the major initiatives. If you look at the initiatives taken up by Prayas, started in 1990, initially started work with under trial prisoners, but today it targets women and male youth in prisons, those in protective custody, trafficked women, families of criminal justice system, affected people like children of prisoners, persons released from custody, those vulnerable to crime, prostitution, victimization or sexual exploitation. Prayas has tried to go beyond these issues, both human rights and custodial justice, into seeing them as persons in need of psychosocial and rehabilitative care. Today in this module, to sum up, what we have tried to do is to give you an understanding of what social work intervention in the criminal justice is all about, what are its basic principles, how do we work with such populations, what are the skills and strategies that are required to work with such populations, what are the kind of initiatives that has been taken place both by civil society and by academic institutions like TISS to promote the concept of social work and criminal justice social work. Thank you.